Have you ever listened to a speech which has no definite beginning or end and it rambles everywhere in between? And did you hear a take-home message? No. In this video, Don Rita is going to show you how to construct a speech, a short talk or a seminar in 10 easy steps. Regardless of the occasion, a short talk, a social occasion, a business presentation or seminar, you will learn how to prepare a speech which is interesting, logical, and gives your audience a strong take-home message. After Don Rita's presentation, you'll be able to complete your group assessment task, in which you apply the elements of speech construction. But first, let's watch Don Rita in The Power of Three. The Power of Three, Don Rita Reifman.
One Sunday, a young freshly ordained priest was giving a sermon or a homily. And he got up to the words, "Behold, I am coming," and then had a memory lapse. And then he remembered that his homiletics professor in the seminary had taught him that if ever this should happen to him, he should just pause and repeat the last thing he'd said, as if it had some grave importance. So he repeated, "Behold, I am coming." But no, he still couldn't remember what came next. A third time he said, "Behold, I am coming." And in desperation and shock and nervousness, he tripped over himself and landed in the lap of the lady in the front pew. "Oh, I'm so sorry, madam," he said. And the lady said, "No, Father, it's entirely my fault. After all, you did warn me 3 times. Students, in this session, we're going to talk about giving a speech and how you can avoid this memory lapse with a simple formula that I call the power of 3. Now let's talk about 2 students I observed once. Student number 1 in the end of year seminar gave his speech, and the whole time he faced his PowerPoint and not the audience. He spoke with a monotone. He read from a myopic text and therefore had his head down and no eye contact with the audience at all. And on his PowerPoint, it was so busy with graphs and figures and words that most of the audience members couldn't understand. Well, by the end of his seminar, I don't think any of us really knew much more about the point he was trying to make. But there was a second student, we'll call student number 2. When she gave her seminar, she elected to get out from behind the lectern. She stood on the stage in front of the audience. She was able to use her body and look at the audience all around. Yes, she had a PowerPoint too. It was up behind her in a place where she wasn't obscuring or standing in the light field, and it was full of photographs that she'd taken in the field to explain the point that she was making. This second student went home having left a memorable impression on her audience. Now I'm going to show you how we can use the power of 3 to avoid memory lapse, like the priest, and speak with the power of student number 2. But before we do that, let me read to you a presentation that was done by one of my other former students. This was her speech, this was her presentation, and this is how she did it. "The dread of perishing by famine stares us in the face. Our soldiers have not a shoe. The country is past all repute. A wretched one, a very wretched and totally incapable of yielding to Great Britain, of returning for colonising it." These are the words of a young captain in the British Marines, writing back home in 1790 from the new British settlement in Australia. Yet a century later, in defiance of the young officer's prediction, Australians would become the wealthiest people in the world. By the late 19th century, per capita income in Australia was 10% higher than in the USA or in the UK. Few histories of economic transformation are more dramatic than that which occurred in the British settlement in Australia during its first 100 years. In the 18th century, creating an outpost of civilization on the other side of the world was no trivial feat. In our self-deprecating Australian way, there is a tendency to attribute the success of our predecessors to good fortune rather than to talent or hard work. Current Australians like to diminish the achievement of those early Australians by perpetuating the myth that they simply filled an empty continent with sheep and then discovered gold. But there is an alternative point of view. Australia's national story has been one of good fortune, yes, but in the 19th century, Australian success did not lie solely in the existence of opportunities, but rather in having the drive to exploit them. And critical in this respect were the three attributes. First, a spirit of openness and a willingness to experiment with novel ideas. Second, the ambitious nature of the settlers who came to Australia. And third, a belief in the value of knowledge. Let's consider the early Australian spirit of openness. Australians in the 19th century were technology scavengers. They were attuned to technical developments in other parts of the world and quick to profit from them. In the 1880s, when Emil Hansen at Carlsberg Laboratories in Denmark discovered that yeast was composed of different strains of fungi and could be cultivated, Australian brewers imported and applied this knowledge even before the British did, leading to the first large-scale beer manufacturing in Australia and to the creation of Foster's and Resch's brands. Also in the 1880s, it was the rapid adoption of a Swedish invention, Gustav de Laval's mechanical separator, that enabled Australian dairies to enter the global export market for butter. Until then, Australian butter shipped to England had been sold as axle grease. Across a range of industries, it was the capacity to adopt ideas often developed in other parts of the world and to adapt them to Australian needs that led to the success of Australian commerce. The rapid adoption of canning and refrigeration technology enabled Australian graziers to begin exporting meat to Europe, developments that helped underpin the 40-fold increase of cattle in Australia between 1850 and 1900. Similarly, it was the awareness of the geology of other lands that helped Australians to discover gold, copper and tin. And ultimately, after the initial rushes, it was the application of new explosive technologies, new construction techniques, and eventually of new chemical processes that enabled our early miners to maximise their capacity to exploit these resources. Let's turn to the second point, ambition. Technological ambition, specifically, was a second key attribute that helped to define the remarkable trajectory of the Australian colonies in the 19th century. Then, Australians learned not just to copy foreign ideas and to adapt them to local conditions, they proved also that they could do things on a continental scale. Between 1860 and 1890, 16,000 kilometres of railway tracks were laid in Australia, and between 1854 and 1864, 11,000 kilometres of telegraph lines were installed. The telegraph lines especially must have had a remarkable psychological impact in conquering the tyranny of distance. The completion of the 3,000-kilometre overland telegraph line to Darwin in 1872 enabled commodity prices and interest rates to be sent direct to Melbourne and Sydney from London, linking our financial services industry to the epicentre of world trade. But it wasn't just rail and telegraph. By the end of the 19th century, some of our steam engines operated at unparalleled scale. In the 1890s, a steam-powered irrigation system in Mildura sported the largest pumping stations in the world. Likewise, at its completion in 1890, the Beetaloo Dam in South Australia was the highest concrete dam in the Southern Hemisphere, while the famous Coolgardie water pipeline in Western Australia was the longest in the world when it opened at the turn of the century. A triumph of engineering innovation, this structure continues to operate today. This brings us to the third defining feature of that era. Just as openness to new ideas and ambition are often stepping stones to innovation and economic development, so too was a growing domestic interest in education and knowledge. Today, it is not widely appreciated just how much the Australian colonies changed in this respect over the 19th century, but a few facts will illuminate the transition. Reflecting a broad shift in Australian society, illiteracy rates plunged from 1 in 4 in 1860 to 1 in 40 in 1890. The Australian colonies during this time experienced high lay membership of scientific societies, and the opportunities for local higher education expanded dramatically. Between 1850 and 1900, the Australian colonies opened 4 new universities and 4 schools of mines. Unsurprisingly, between 1860 and 1890, the number of scientists in New South Wales grew at double the rate of the population as a whole. To give the example of a single firm, CSR employed just 1 chemist in 1879, but the number had grown to more than 50 by 1900. Many nations have been blessed, like ours, with bountiful natural resources, and yet have failed to convert this good fortune into prosperous, peaceful and dynamic societies. Argentina, Angola, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Iran, Libya, Nigeria, Russia and Venezuela are a few examples. The modern histories of these nations show that there is more to our prosperity here in Australia than our land mass or what lies under it. One can safely conclude that fundamental to Australia's successful transition from famished penal outpost to innovative and export-oriented economy were the 3 cultural traits outlined so far. 1, the Australian openness to ideas and connectedness to global networks. 2, the Australian ambition and willingness to realise ambitious goals through technology. And 3, an underlying appreciation of the value of knowledge. This is Sylvia's speech as she gave it. Now, Sylvia didn't read it out, as I just did. I commend her. Sylvia actually memorised the whole thing. She said that speech, word for word, as you just heard me say, as you just heard me read to you, from memory. Now, I don't know about you, but I wouldn't be so good at memorising everything in a speech that length in such a way that I'd be certain not to lose my place or have a mental blank, a memory lapse. And besides that, the paper, whether read or memorised, does read like an essay. Now, do you intend to read out like a conference paper, as many people at conferences will do? Or will this message of yours be a spoken word? The challenge is to reduce it to 1 page of notes to keep you on track, and then to speak conversationally about each point, as if a friend had casually asked you what you're going to speak about at your next seminar. Of course, we have to begin by identifying your target audience. Now, I'm not going to spend time on that because we've already talked about that in a previous video. We'll go straight into building the speech. Now, let's take Sylvia's speech as an example. Once you know who your target audience is, the next thing you need to do is decide what the purpose of your speech will be. Are you aiming to inform your audience or persuade them, or are you entertaining them or inspiring your audience? You need to know clearly in your mind which of these 4 purposes will be the purpose of your speech. Now, once you've decided the purpose of your speech, you need to put that in a sentence. For example, the purpose of my speech is to persuade the audience, to persuade my target audience. And in this case, we'll choose the target audience as a group of educated general audience members. Once we know that much, we have to think, what are we going to persuade them? With the thought that what? Now, the what needs to contain a verb. The aim of my speech is to persuade a general educated audience with the thought that, and in Sylvia's speech, Australian success did not lie solely in the existence of opportunities, but rather in having the drive to exploit them. That's the main point of Sylvia's speech. Now, once you have identified your target audience and identified the main purpose of your speech with the verb and the whole sentence, the purpose sentence, keep that purpose sentence always in mind, reducing it to perhaps, in this case, Australians succeeded through the drive to exploit opportunities. We're going to think about that all the time. And thinking of that sentence, we then select 3 main points. And this is why this is the power of 3, because everybody can remember 3 main points. With your purpose sentence in mind, develop the body of the speech. Ask what, when, how, why, where, when. These sorts of questions to build your 3 main points. For example, we might select how. How did Australians succeed through the drive to exploit opportunities? From Sylvia's speech, she has 3 points that answer how. Firstly, she says, through a spirit of openness and willingness to experiment with novel ideas. Her second how is the ambitious nature of the settlers who came to Australia, and her third how was a belief in the value of knowledge. Now, from her speech, these 3 points are quite clear. She certainly wrote a very good essay. But what we're trying to do is turn your essay, your written assignment, into a speech that really works for your audience. Once we've developed the 3 main points with the purpose sentence in mind, we are ready to get on to developing the body of the speech. And this is what we do. We take each of those 3 points and for each of them come up with 2 or 3 sub-points. Again, it's easy to remember, 2 or 3 sub-points for each of those 3 points that we are going to remember. And for each of those sub-points, we select it and then we explain it in 2 to 4 sentences and then give an example. Now, when you give an example of things, use stories, anecdotes, statistics, whatever is relevant for the topic that you are on about. So, for example, again, if we take Sylvia's presentation, the first point she had, remember, was the spirit of openness and a willingness to experiment with novel ideas. She then goes on to explain that 19th century Australians were technology scavengers. And isn't that a great term? Technology scavengers. Use terms like this, fresh ideas, fresh language, in the way that you approach writing your speech. And then she gives examples. The yeast, the Australian brewers imported and then applied new knowledge, and we ended up with the Australian beer manufacturing and Foster's and Resch's companies. And then secondly, she talks about de Laval's mechanical separator and the way that it was linked to Australian butter and making it better so that they no longer sold it to England for axle grease. Sylvia then goes on to her second sub-point from her first main idea. And this is how Australians adopted and adapted ideas to Australian needs, which led to Australian commerce. She then gives 3 examples: the canning and refrigeration technology and how that is linked to meat exports to Europe. She talks secondly about overseas geology and how that was linked with gold and copper and tin discoveries in Australia. And finally, explosive technologies and construction techniques and chemical processes and how it enabled miners to maximise their capacity. After you've done this for your first main point, you then go on to your second main point and you give an example and you explain 3 subpoints from that second main point. And of course after that you do the same thing for the third main point and you give 3 subpoints and SEE. Select it, give an example and explain. Now once you've written these 3 main points each with its 3 subpoints, which are easy to remember because there's only 3 of each, the next job you have to do to be able to make it a speech is tighten and reinforce your message with link sentences. Links provide smooth transitions from one idea to another and between your subpoints. And links kind of help to keep your audience on track and know where you're going. For example, you might say, let's now go to the second point. Or, this brings us to the third feature of that era. Saying these link sentences helps your audience to know, oh, we're finished with idea now we're going on to the next idea. Now you've now written the body of your speech, but you're not finished yet. You need now to create a strong introduction. Now here I'm not talking about the introduction that the MC gives in introducing you. That is another job that also needs to be done. But right now we're talking about your introduction, the first words you say in your speech. Your introduction needs to grab the audience's attention and it needs to introduce the topic, of course. So you couldn't just tell a joke that has nothing to do with the topic you're about to speak about. I began today with a joke at the beginning about the priest and the homily. But that joke was related directly to the topic I was about to speak about. Whatever you do, you need to establish a rapport with the audience because that first few seconds of you in front of them will make up their minds for them about whether or not you're worth listening to. You need to establish yourself as an authority and you need to make them want to listen to you. For example, in Sylvia's case, she started off with, the dread of perishing by famine stares us in the face. Our soldiers have not a shoe. The country is past all repute a wretched one, a very wretched and totally incapable of yielding to Great Britain a return for colonising it. Yes, Sylvia started with a quote, and that is a good way to introduce your speech. You might, on the other hand, take a different approach. Perhaps you will start with an example of what not to do. Now, if you decide to do this, just be careful, because it may just be that your example of what not to do sets the audience on the wrong foot to start with and doesn't create a very good impression of you. For example, if I were to come and give you a speech about body language and trip all over myself as I walked in, that would be an example of what not to do. But it wouldn't give you a very good first impression of me. So do be careful. Another approach would perhaps be to give a preview of what will follow. A little bit of this is what I'm about to say. And in a sense, Sylvia does that in her speech also. Or you might ask a question. Ask a question of the audience. That's always a good strategy. Then you need to pause, of course, and give the audience a chance to consider the answer, their answer, to the question that you've asked. Now, it may be the kind of question you actually want them to put up their hand and answer you, and if so, indicate it by putting your hand up. You'll get a lot more respondents that way. Or it may be a rhetorical question. We're just considering the audience and allowing them to think for themselves and just ponder on the question you've raised. Either way, it's another good way to start your speech. Another way to do your introduction is simply to say nothing and to begin with an object or a picture and just put that in front of the audience to look at. My husband gave a speech recently and he walked in with a pair of Dutch clogs and he held them up and then he put them in a place for the audience to look at them and then launched into the speech, which of course by then the audience knew was going to be about Dutch clogs. Finally, another way to introduce your speech might be to perform an action, to do something. Act out a thing that is related directly to your speech, that gets your audience looking, gets their attention. Sometimes what they see is way more powerful than you using words. Now you've written the body of your speech and you have worked away to get your audience's immediate and undivided attention. But you're not finished yet. You need now to create a strong closing. A closing that does summarize your main points, but also achieves a sense of closure, so the audience feels satisfied that yes, this thing has come to an end. We now have a fairly complete picture of what the speaker was saying. Your closure might be a joke with a punchline. That's a possible way, and that leaves the audience remembering what you said. Perhaps it'll be some other way of signalling to the audience to listen to you first. For example, in summary, let me end by saying. Another strategy might be to, as it were, bookend your conclusion with your introduction by repeating part of the opening that you used. Some way that the audience will recognise, oh, she's come full circle now, and now we're finishing off. In your conclusion, you need to make an impact. That's the important thing. What is your take-home message? Now, never start a speech if you don't already know in your mind what your take-home message is. If you were to ask the audience a week later, what did I say at that speech? What would you like your audience to be able to remember and come back and say to you? What must your audience remember for your message to have gotten through? Now again, let's look at Sylvia's speech and her strong closing. She says, there is more to our prosperity here in Australia than our landmass or what lies under it. Fundamental to Australia's successful transition from famished penal outpost to innovative and export-oriented economy were the three cultural traits: the spirit of openness and a willingness to experiment with novel ideas, the ambitious natures of the settlers who came to Australia, and a belief in the value of knowledge. Sylvia finishes well. She draws together the three main points in her speech and puts them there again for the audience to remind them of what the topic was all about. Now you might think now that that's the end of the Power of Three speech. We're still not quite there yet. You now have an audience-grabbing introduction, a good 3-point with subpoints body of your speech, and a dynamic conclusion. But you won't get an audience if you haven't had a fabulous title of some sort. Your title should be a major attraction if you're going to get the audience there on the seats in the room where you'll be listening to you in the first place. Now, when you're thinking of your title, it needs to be something that reflects your purpose sentence. You know, it needs to be something that gives the audience a little clue of what your speech is going to be about, and has to lead directly into your speech. But at the same time, your fabulous title needs to be something that arouses curiosity by the intriguing use of language, ideally. For example, the speech I'm giving to you right now. I thought about it for a while. What could be a good title for a speech like that? And I decided on The Power of Three. The Power of Three does directly relate into my speech because I'm telling you about the power in having three main ideas, because that will enable you to remember and not forget. But at the same time, there's a little bit of a twisty catch, because most of us have heard of Bryce Courtney's book, The Power of One. The Power of Three is just taking that into a slightly different direction, and it may just be a little catchy. Now you've written your speech. You have your whole speech written, as well as the catchy title that you'll put up on your posters and billboards so that everybody will know that they'd want to come to your speech. There's still one thing left to do though, and I think you already know what it is. It's writing your own introduction, the beginning of your speech. And I need say no more about that, because we've already been there, and you know how important it is that everybody deserves a good introduction for their speech, and nobody doesn't need an introduction. I just want to conclude with a little word about notes. When you write your notes, don't do what Sylvia did. Can you see this? If you can't, don't fret, because you can find it in your Module 7 under the Power of Three speech. It's called Sylvia's speech. Have a look. Now that in fact is what I'm telling you not to do. That is more like an essay. What you're going to do is write your notes with only the main points, just in case you do forget one of those three things. You think, oh, what was the second point again? Oh yeah, that's right. Now I know what I was going to talk about. Only the main points, just a word or two to remind you what's next. And you may find that you don't even need to refer to those notes at all. But write them big, not in the usual 12 font, but 14 or 16, and I often bold it as well, and double spaced. That way you can easily see it at a bit of a distance, and you don't have to be looking down closely at notes. On your pages, keep them one-sided, so that as you slip from one page to another, you can just pull it across, and you don't have to be flapping around pieces of paper, which would become a distraction for you and your audience, and perhaps even drop on the floor. A little tip, number your pages. What if you dropped them on the way in, or just before, and you couldn't put them in the right order anymore? How difficult it would be, when you're already a bit nervous, to then find that the next page is not the right one, and then you're on the wrong track altogether. So do number your pages and keep them in order. I often use a highlighter pen. Even though I've got my main points only on my notes, sometimes there are certain words that I really want to make sure I don't leave out, or a really important word that is the essential thrust of the next main point I'm making. And so I get out my highlighter on my note and just highlight that. And if you're using PowerPoints, I usually put a little text box just beside the place where it will go, because that for me makes it easier to see where I have to push the next PowerPoint slide along. And finally, practice. Always remember to leave yourself enough time to practice your presentation. It may take you longer than you thought, or maybe you've got enough time left over and you can insert an extra story. But you won't know that if you haven't practiced with a stopwatch. Last night I was at my Toastmasters club, and a lady who used to be a member asked if please could she give a presentation, because she's been writing a book and she just wanted everybody's feeling about this story. And she said, "I don't take 5 minutes, less than 5 minutes." So we said, fine, we're a friendly lot. And Judy got up, but it didn't take 5 minutes. It took 15 minutes. Now that for us cuts seriously into our time, because we run a pretty tight schedule in our club. And what I said to Judy afterwards is, you know what you didn't do, don't you? Next time, do practice it with a stopwatch, and then you'll really know how long the speech is. Poor Judy was very apologetic when she realised how long she'd actually taken. But there you go. Now what I'd like you to do now is to work on your speech construction workshop. You're going to work as a group, and you can choose any of these topics that you can see here. whether you choose what a difference a day makes or what's in a sausage, and you can take a really strange approach to the question, choose any of those questions, topics, or make up a topic of your own if you wish. I really don't mind. But what I do mind, and what I'm giving you the opportunity to do, is to use all the tips and the ideas and the structures of the Power of Three and to come up with a speech, write it together, and then one of you give the presentation and one of you give the introduction. And I'd really like it if you could also implement a little bit of a PowerPoint presentation to go along with it. Well, what are you waiting for? Go and get into that website, email, Skype, UCU, talk to each other and get working and give us the Power of Three.